She had the voice that carried a generation, and the heartbreak no one ever talked about. Cass Elliot broke records, defied stereotypes, and was still mocked by her own bandmates. So, how did the woman behind California Dreamin' become the target of cruel jokes, scandals, and one of the most disrespectful death rumors in music history? This is the story the world got wrong, and the truth it almost forgot. The voice that broke through a wall of prejudice. Cass Elliot didn't grow up with much. She was born Ellen Naomi Cohen in Baltimore, Maryland in 1941 into a Russian Jewish immigrant family that barely had enough to get by. The house was always a little too cold in the winter, and there were more bills than blankets. But Cass didn't let her surroundings decide who she was. Even as a kid, she had something about her, this spark that made people stop and look twice. She carried herself like someone who already knew she was going to be something special. In a world that handed her limits, Cass built a personality that broke through them. She didn't fit the mold of what a star was supposed to look like, but her voice and spirit were too big to ignore. From a young age, she dealt with comments about her weight and looks, but she kept leaning into what felt real, making people feel something when she performed. High school is when she really found her thing. The theater stage became her world. She lit up during school plays, belted out songs, and started to see herself as more than just a girl from a struggling family. Theater gave her a place to shine, and it's where she created her new identity, Cass Elliot. She chose the name as a way to start fresh. Cass came from actress Peggy Cass, a bold and funny woman she admired. Elliot was in memory of a friend she'd lost. So the name wasn't random. It meant something. It was her way of becoming the version of herself that she believed could take on the world. After high school, Cass didn't wait around. She packed her bags and went straight to New York City. Her dream was to be on Broadway, not just singing, but acting, standing under hot lights and soaking in the applause. But New York didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. She went to auditions, waited in lines, and gave everything she had. Still, casting directors didn't see her as a lead. One of the biggest hits came when she auditioned for a part that ended up going to a young woman named Barbra Streisand. That kind of rejection doesn't just sting, it leaves a scar. Cass realized that the theater world wasn't going to give her a fair shot. They had a narrow idea of beauty and star power, and she didn't fit into their frame. But instead of quitting, she pivoted. Music had always been there in the background, something she loved, something she could lean on. If the stage wouldn't take her voice, maybe the radio would. She dove into the folk music scene, which was exploding in the early 60s. Cass formed her first real group, the Big Three, with musicians Tim Rose and Jim Hendrix. They played small clubs, got some attention, and even landed a few television spots. It wasn't superstardom, but it was something. The band eventually broke up, and Cass moved on to her next project, a new group called the Mugwumps. That's when she met Denny Doherty. Denny had a smooth voice and an easy charm, and the two of them clicked musically. There was an instant connection on stage, and for Cass, something deeper off stage too. She felt something real with him, something that went beyond harmonies. But that's a story for another time. With the Mugwumps, Cass was finally stepping into a bigger arena. They had talent, they had drive, and they were doing what so many artists dream of, creating something original. But even then, it wasn't easy. Folk rock was competitive. You had to stand out in every way. Cass had the voice for it, deep, soulful, and full of emotion that couldn't be faked. She poured her entire self into every performance. Still, she knew she needed more than just a good band. She needed the right one, the one that could take her to the next level. Eventually, her path crossed again with Denny Doherty. Only this time, he was part of a new group. It was a tight circle made up of Denny, John Phillips, and Michelle Phillips. Cass saw something in them, maybe potential, maybe hope, maybe just the next step she needed to take. So she reached out. She knocked on that door, hoping to be let in. Rejected, ridiculed, and still unstoppable. Her voice was unlike anyone else's. It was rich, emotional, and full of power. Denny knew this. He'd sung with her before and could hear the magic in what she brought. But there was a roadblock, and his name was John Phillips. John was the kind of guy who had a vision for everything. how the group should sound, how it should look, even how they should move. And in his mind, Cass didn't fit. When asked, he said her voice didn't match the rest of the group. He said her tone was too deep for the harmonies he'd written. But that wasn't the real reason. Behind closed doors, it came down to how Cass looked. John didn't think she had the right image for the band. He believed her weight would hurt their chances in a market built on visual appeal as much as sound. He didn't say that part out loud in interviews, but the message got across anyway. Cass could feel it every time she showed up and saw the way he avoided eye contact, every time he called someone else to sing instead, every time he left her out of the conversation. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was really going on. Even Michelle Phillips later admitted that things got cruel. Cass wasn't treated like a guest or even like a peer. She was more like the help. They had her getting drinks, cleaning up, standing off to the side. When they rehearsed, she was sometimes invited to sing, but never to perform. They teased her, laughed behind her back, and made her feel like a groupie who didn't know when to leave. But she didn't walk away. Cass stuck around, not out of desperation, but because she believed she had something they needed. She followed them city to city, rehearsal to rehearsal, never raising her voice in anger, just showing up again and again with her talent intact. She knew that if they gave her one real shot, one honest place in the group, the whole sound would change, and for the better. Denny saw it. Even Michelle felt it. John was the only one still holding back, and he was running out of reasons. Time has a funny way of forcing change. The band started to run into trouble. The gigs dried up, the money stopped coming in, and the lifestyle caught up with them. They weren't just stuck. They were broke. They needed help, and they knew only one person who had a place for them to crash. Cass had moved to Los Angeles, and when they showed up at her doorstep, she didn't turn them away. She welcomed them in. But this time, she made sure they understood the deal. Cass wasn't going to be the outsider anymore. She gave them a roof over their heads, and in return, she got what she had been asking for all along, a seat at the table. No more rehearsing from the sidelines, no more jokes or empty promises. She was part of the group now, officially, fully. And once her voice became part of the blend, something shifted. The sound was unforgettable. The group rebranded themselves as the Mamas and the Papas. They had their name, they had their lineup, and for the first time they had a harmony that felt complete. Cass's vocals lifted the entire arrangement. Suddenly the group wasn't another folk band in a crowded scene. They were something different, something people remembered after the song ended. The thing is, Cass didn't get there through charm or connections. She pushed through rejection, humiliation, and flat-out cruelty. It took everything she had to stand her ground without lashing out. But she held it together long enough for the music to speak for her. And once the group had Cass in the mix, they stopped drifting. They started climbing. Radio stations took notice. Audiences responded. Music executives leaned in. With Cass officially in the picture, the hits were just around the corner. California Dreamin' came at a price. The Mamas and the Papas hit people right in the gut. Those harmonies, that songwriting, and Cass Elliott's unmistakable voice, California Dreamin', didn't just become their first hit, it became a whole mood, a sound that stuck to the back of your brain. Suddenly they were everywhere, radio, TV, magazine covers. They had the attention, the fame, the fans, but behind the golden glow of the spotlight, something ugly was still happening. And Cass was the one carrying the weight of it. After finally breaking into the group, Cass should have been celebrated. Her voice gave the band its magic. She was the reason those songs felt so full and emotional. But instead of admiration, she kept getting slapped with nicknames and backhanded jokes. The worst of it came in their own lyrics. In the song Creek Alley, they tossed in a line that hit like a cheap shot. "No one's getting fat except Mama Cass." It was meant to be clever, but ended up being cruel. The nickname Mama Cass stuck after that, and not in a cute or affectionate way. It became a punchline that followed her everywhere. Journalists ran with it. Talk show hosts repeated it. The audience laughed, even when the joke came with a sting. But through all of it, Cass stayed composed. She smiled on cue, gave interviews, posed for pictures, and kept singing like nothing was wrong. But it was wrong. What made it worse was that her bandmates never stepped in to shut it down. They didn't defend her or ask for the jokes to stop. If anything, they leaned into it. The jokes weren't just backstage whispers, they were part of the act. The band let the public turn her into a character instead of a person, and Cass had to sit in the middle of it, carrying the pressure of fame and the pain of being mocked by the same people who owed their success to her voice. Cass knew how to work a crowd. She had natural charisma and timing, but she also knew how to hold pain in her chest while giving the performance people expected. No one saw the weight of the teasing, the moments in dressing rooms when the words replayed over and over. No one saw what it felt like to be known more for her size than her sound. She never broke down in front of the cameras, but the bruises added up. The pressure grew with each performance, each press tour, each appearance where someone slipped in a joke about her weight or called her mama with a wink. She couldn't escape it. It was in the scripts, in the stage banter, in the way people introduced her. And even if the group didn't say the jokes themselves, they allowed them to keep happening. What started as small jabs became part of her public identity. She had to perform through the noise, knowing that the world was laughing at the image more than listening to the sound. That silence, the lack of defense from the people closest to her, said more than any lyric ever could, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Just as the band was hitting its peak, Cass was beginning to feel more isolated than ever. The success didn't erase the damage. It only made it louder. And while Cass kept hitting the high notes, something underneath it all was starting to slip. The worst part wasn't the public laughter, it was what happened behind the scenes. When someone Cass cared about made it personal, and everything changed. A one-sided love that broke her heart. Cass Elliot could stand in front of thousands and pour her soul into a song, but the one thing she couldn't reach was the heart of the man standing just a few feet away on stage. Denny Doherty wasn't just a voice next to hers. He was the person she fell for, quietly and completely. She never made a big show out of it, never demanded anything. She just hoped, day after day, that maybe he'd notice what was right in front of him. They'd shared hotel rooms, rehearsals, stage lights. She knew his habits, his moods, the way he laughed when something caught him off guard. Every harmony they sang together felt personal. It was hard not to fall for someone when you were building music that felt that intimate. And for Cass, it wasn't a crush. It was real, and it hurt more because it had no place to land. Denny never returned those feelings. He kept it casual, friendly, focused on the band. Cass could live with that, until the day he confessed something that took her breath away. He had started seeing Michelle Phillips, the one woman in the group Cass could never quite feel equal to. Michelle had the kind of beauty that got magazine covers without trying. Cass already felt the weight of standing next to her, being compared, being overlooked. And now the man she loved had chosen her too. Cass didn't scream or start drama. She looked at Michelle and asked a single question that cut through all the tension in the room. Why take the one man I love? There was no anger in her voice, just heartbreak. It wasn't just a matter of rejection. It was about feeling invisible to the people she trusted most. Still, she didn't walk away. She kept showing up to rehearsals, doing interviews, performing live. She knew they all saw her pain, but nobody ever addressed it. They kept moving forward like nothing had changed, and Cass had to act like she was fine while standing shoulder to shoulder with the couple that broke her heart. That kind of silence stings deeper than words. Cass carried that hurt quietly, but it stayed with her. Long after the music faded, it was still sitting inside her chest. One night, when everything had built up too much, she asked Denny to marry her. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no either. He just sat there, too drunk to respond. She got her answer in the silence. That silence never left. It followed her into studio sessions, echoed during sound checks, and grew louder every time she saw Denny and Michelle whispering in the corner. She wasn't just dealing with unreturned love. She was trying to function inside a group where her feelings were stepped over and brushed aside. And still, she sang. She hit every note, gave every performance her full self. Nobody in the audience knew what was going on behind the scenes. They just saw the smile, the voice, the charm. They didn't see how hard it was to stand in the same space as someone you loved, knowing it wasn't mutual. Eventually, Cass started to shift her focus. If love wasn't going to show up for her, She would pour her energy into something that wouldn't ignore her, her music. She began thinking about what came next, outside the group, outside the drama. She was already looking ahead, not because she didn't like the group, but because she needed something she could actually count on. London, lies, and a scandal waiting to erupt. By 1967, the Mamas and the Papas were running on fumes. Behind the pretty harmonies and flashy appearances, everything felt strained. Cass Elliot had been holding it together, still hitting her marks, still showing up, but emotionally, she was somewhere else. The band wasn't her safe space anymore. The weight of jokes, disrespect, and heartbreak had chipped away at her piece by piece. So when an opportunity came to perform in London ahead of the group, she took it. A change of pace, a different city, a chance to breathe. Cass arrived in London ready to prepare for a show. But before she could even warm up her voice, things went sideways. Police showed up and took her into custody over what sounded ridiculous at first. Missing linens from the apartment she was staying in. Bed sheets. That's what made headlines. She was accused of stealing them, the kind of thing tabloids love to twist into a circus. But what was happening behind the scenes was a whole lot messier than just some laundry going missing. There was a man named Pick Dawson, and he wasn't just a name in Cass's social circle. He was on the radar of London authorities for reasons that had nothing to do with music. Cass had been linked to him. Some said they were close, some said more. And the police weren't really interested in the linens. They were interested in her connection to Dawson. It looked like they were hoping to use her as a way in, trying to pressure her into talking, or at the very least, tarnishing her enough to make their job easier. Cass sat in custody overnight. The charges didn't stick. There was no evidence she stole anything. But by the time she walked out, the damage was already done. News outlets had the story. Headlines painted her as careless, reckless, maybe even dangerous. The press didn't hold back. They didn't wait for facts. They ran with the most dramatic version of events they could write, the kind that made readers stop and stare. The band canceled the London performance. They said it was to protect their image, but the truth was they didn't want the heat. Instead of standing beside Cass, they pulled back. She was left in the center of the scandal alone. She had opened her home to them before. She had saved the band when they were struggling. Now, when her name needed defending, they disappeared. That arrest may have been temporary, but the fallout lingered. Cass had always known she wasn't treated like an equal inside the group, but this moment pushed things over the edge. She didn't just feel like an outsider anymore. She felt disposable. She became the easy one to blame when things got uncomfortable, the one whose image could take the hit so the others didn't have to. And people noticed. Not the fans. They kept listening, buying records, playing her voice in the background of their lives. But inside the industry and inside the band, people started seeing her as a problem to manage instead of an artist to support. That feeling followed her everywhere, even after the headlines died down. Cass didn't make a scene about it. She never stood in front of microphones and told the world how alone she felt. She went quiet. She started thinking differently. The idea of being in a group, sharing space with people who didn't value her, she was done with that. The band had used her voice. They had used her energy. But they never saw her as someone who could lead. Now she started asking herself what it would look like to stop proving anything at all. She didn't need their approval. She had her own voice, her own rhythm, her own presence. The world had already heard it. She just needed to remind them where it came from. That night in custody marked the end of something. The Cass who kept waiting for acceptance, who stayed quiet when the jokes got too loud, who held on to a group that never held her back. That version of her was gone. Something new was about to begin. She was ready to stand alone. And the next time her name made headlines, it wouldn't be because of scandal. It would be because of something unforgettable. Dreaming a little dream and going solo. Cass Elliot had spent years holding up the Mamas and the Papas with her voice, her energy, and her patience. By the time she walked away from the group, she wasn't interested in pleasing anyone anymore. She wanted freedom, and that came in the form of a solo record, and a song that would quietly become one of the most iconic in her career. Dream a Little Dream of Me wasn't even supposed to be her solo spotlight. It was tucked into the end of a Mamas and Papas album, and somehow her voice just stole the moment. The tone, the mood, the emotion. It was all Cass. The track got picked up on the radio, and suddenly, everyone was talking about her in a different way. This wasn't just about harmonies or being part of a group. This was her, front and center, showing the world what she could do on her own. With that buzz behind her, Cass got a massive offer, one of the biggest of her life. A headlining gig at Caesars Palace in Las Vegas. It was a 3-week contract with a 6-figure payout. Big names were already being lined up to attend. This was a career-defining moment. All the rejection, all the years of being overlooked, it was finally turning around. She was about to prove herself to the industry, the critics, and the same people who never let her lead before. But pressure does strange things, and Cass felt it closing in fast. The Vegas spotlight wasn't kind. It demanded perfection, glamour, control. The kind of polished image Cass had never been given the space to build. And she knew what people would say the second she stepped on that stage. She heard it her whole life. So she decided to transform herself before opening night, not with rehearsals, not with vocal prep, with weight loss. She started a crash diet that quickly became dangerous. For 7 months, she ate only 3 days a week and fasted the other 4. The weight came off. So did her energy. Her body was pushed to the edge. Her immune system broke down. She got tonsillitis. Her vocal cords were inflamed. Mono hit. Then came hepatitis. All while she was getting ready to walk onto one of the biggest stages in the country. She barely had time to rehearse. Her voice was thin. Her body was exhausted. But the show was booked, and the press was already printing headlines. So she put on the makeup, stepped into her dress, and walked onto the Caesars Palace stage. The room was full of stars: Sammy Davis Jr., Jimi Hendrix, Mia Farrow, big names in the audience, all eyes on her. The first performance started. Her voice cracked. She missed notes. She was trying to keep up with the band while barely holding herself together. The crowd didn't boo. They walked out, quietly, row by row, one of the most humiliating things for any performer to experience. And then came the second show of the night. Cass went back out again. Her voice was worse. The audience even smaller, the energy completely drained. By morning, Caesars Palace canceled her contract. The newspapers had a field day. Newsweek compared the performance to the Titanic. Not just a flop, a disaster. Critics wrote her off like it was the end of the road. And Cass took the hit in silence. She fell into a deep depression. It wasn't just the show that broke her, it was everything that led to that moment. The years of being told she wasn't good enough unless she changed. The constant pressure to shrink herself, literally and figuratively. She had tried to fit the mold, and in the process, she damaged her health, her voice, and her sense of self. But even in the middle of all that, when the public embarrassment was fresh and the industry had turned its back, Cass didn't fall apart completely. She stayed close to something that gave her strength, something personal that no one else knew about. While the world was watching the headlines, she kept her focus on what mattered to her privately. It gave her the will to keep going, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. And while the world focused on her public failures, Cass was quietly holding together something far more important, something she refused to let the spotlight touch. A mother's secret, kept until the end. Cass Elliot could handle the critics. She could handle the jokes, the dismissals, the betrayals. But when it came to her daughter, she didn't let anyone in. In the middle of a chaotic career, when every magazine wanted a headline and every camera wanted a moment, Cass quietly gave birth to a baby girl. Her name was Owen, and from the second she entered the world, Cass changed. She didn't parade her around for press photos or share sweet stories in interviews. She shut the door. There were no baby announcements, no interviews about motherhood, no tell-all stories. The only people who knew about Owen were the ones Cass chose to trust, and even that circle stayed small. She refused to reveal who the father was. Reporters asked, friends speculated, but Cass never gave up the name. The mystery only added fuel to the media's obsession, but she stood her ground. In a world where everything about her had been public for years, her body, her voice, her heartbreak, this was the one thing she kept just for herself. She made it clear early on that she would protect her daughter at all costs. Nannies were hired and fired in rotation. Some lasted only weeks. The moment she sensed someone getting too attached or too familiar, she let them go. Her reasoning wasn't cruel, it was defensive. She didn't want anyone else becoming a second parent or leaking anything to the press. She wanted full control over her child's life and space to build something that felt safe. Cass didn't talk much about being a mother, but behind closed doors, that's where most of her energy went. While the public picked apart her performances or speculated about her weight, she was focused on bottles, bedtime, and building some form of stability. It wasn't perfect. The industry pulled her in every direction. But when she was home, she was all in. Her daughter never became part of the celebrity machine. Owen grew up in a world that was intentionally kept quiet. Cass didn't want fame touching that part of her life. She'd seen too much of what it could do to people. She had lived through all the ways it chipped away at identity, especially as a woman in entertainment. She didn't want that cycle repeating with her child. The truth about Owen's father stayed locked away for years. People guessed. Names were thrown around, including a few industry insiders, but Cass refused to say a word, not to protect the man, to protect her daughter from becoming gossip. She knew how quickly a story could spin out of control, especially when it involved a child, and she didn't want her daughter defined by someone else's last name. It wasn't until decades later that the mystery was finally solved. Michelle Phillips, the only other surviving member of the Mamas and the Papas, eventually confirmed that Owen's father was Chuck Day. He was a guitarist who worked closely with the band, someone who had been in the background during some of their most famous recordings. He wasn't a household name. He never claimed paternity, and Cass never pushed him to. The decision to stay silent about Chuck Day wasn't about shame, it was about boundaries. Cass had given so much of herself to the public that this one act of silence became a kind of power. She got to choose what stayed sacred. And that choice wasn't for attention, it was for survival. She poured every part of herself into being the kind of mother she never got to be on stage. No one gave her instructions, there was no roadmap. She was figuring it out while juggling work, headlines, loneliness, and pressure. But even when things around her collapsed, she came home and showed up for her child. No one could see how hard she was working behind the scenes. The stage was always more glamorous than the living room. But to Cass, the real performance was motherhood, and that was where she refused to fail. But even with everything she tried to shut out, the past had a way of creeping back in. The world kept pulling her name into headlines she didn't ask for. The Manson rumors that refused to die. Cass Elliot knew how to throw a party. Her home in Laurel Canyon became a go-to spot for the Hollywood crowd. Actors, musicians, producers, writers, her place was always buzzing with laughter, guitars, and the sound of glasses clinking. She welcomed people into her world without asking too many questions. She loved the energy, the chaos, the company. If you were talented, interesting, or just needed a place to crash, Cass probably had a spot for you. But that openness came back to haunt her in the ugliest way. In 1969, everything changed. The shocking murder of Sharon Tate and others at the hands of Charles Manson and his followers rocked Hollywood to its core. Suddenly, the peace and love atmosphere of the 60s had a dark undercurrent. Everyone was looking around, trying to understand how someone like Manson had gotten so close to their scene. And people started pointing fingers. That's when Cass's name got pulled into the chaos. John Phillips, her former bandmate, went on record saying that Cass had introduced Manson to their circle. He claimed that Manson had been at one of Cass's parties. That statement was all it took. Reporters latched onto it. The public ran with it. The idea that Cass had opened her doors to someone like Manson became part of her story overnight, even though there was no proof she had any relationship with him at all. The rumors spun quickly. Some articles suggested she had invited Manson over regularly. Others hinted she was connected to his followers. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. People love a scandal more than they love a correction. And Cass, already carrying so many unfair labels, suddenly had a new one to deal with: guilt by association. It didn't help that Cass wasn't a media fighter. She didn't jump on talk shows to defend herself. She didn't hold a press conference or threaten lawsuits. She stayed quiet, the same way she had when people made fun of her size or disrespected her role in the band. But the silence gave people room to keep talking, and the talking never stopped. She became another name in the Manson conversation, not because of anything she did, but because someone tossed her into it. The same industry that had used her voice to sell millions of records now let her image get dragged through something horrifying. There's no record of Cass ever spending real time with Manson. Maybe he showed up to a party once. Maybe someone brought him without her knowing. Maybe none of it happened at all. What's clear is that no authorities ever charged her, questioned her seriously, or followed up on any formal connection. But the damage was already done. The whispers stayed long after the headlines faded. It didn't matter that her focus had always been music and motherhood. To the public, she became another side note in a story full of fear and violence. She had spent her career trying to be seen as more than a punchline. Now, she was being painted as part of something horrific. Through all of it, Cass kept moving forward. She appeared on television. She hosted variety shows. She kept singing. Her voice still filled living rooms and radios, even while her name was being dragged through tabloid mud. It was like she was living two lives, one where she was the funny, soulful star America loved, and another where she was quietly carrying rumors that refused to die. And as time passed, the pressure took a toll. The joy she used to bring to the stage started to dim. She still smiled, still gave it everything she had, but something behind her eyes had shifted. She had been carrying too much for too long. Every rumor, every headline, every betrayal, none of it was forgotten. She kept going, but her health was starting to show signs of strain. The world was too busy spinning gossip to notice. By the time people did, it was already too late. The last days of Mama Cass. Cass Elliot had a way of powering through things, but in the summer of 1974, her body began telling a story she could no longer cover up. It started quietly backstage at The Tonight Show. She collapsed without warning. People rushed in and Cass waved it off. She said it was her blood sugar. Maybe she skipped a meal. Maybe it was nothing. She laughed. Everyone moved on. But the people closest to her could tell something wasn't right. Her face was pale. Her energy flickered like a dying bulb, the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix. Even then, she didn't stop. She had already booked 2 weeks of concerts at the London Palladium, and she was determined to finish them. The shows went on, but behind the curtain, Cass was running on fumes. She was coughing more. She looked thinner. She kept wiping her nose, clearing her throat, trying to fight off whatever her body was fighting inside. She wore fatigue-like makeup, something she could cover, not something she could admit. After finishing her last night on stage, she went straight to Mick Jagger's birthday party, then another event, then a brunch in her honor. The rooms were full of familiar faces, friends, fans, people who had followed her career for years. They noticed how sick she looked. Some said she seemed out of breath. Others said she smiled less than usual. But she still made her rounds, cracking jokes, doing what Cass always did, putting everyone else at ease so they wouldn't worry about her. Later that night, she stopped by a party thrown by Jack Martin, a well-known entertainment journalist. She didn't stay long. Her skin looked clammy. Her voice was weak. And this time, even her good humor couldn't hide it. She said she was tired and left quietly. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. She went home to her flat in Mayfair, London. The apartment belonged to singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson, who was letting her stay there while she was in town. Cass closed the door behind her, kicked off her shoes, and went to bed. The next morning, she didn't come out of her room. Her assistant knocked, then called out, then finally opened the door. Cass was still in bed, peaceful, still, gone. She was just 32 at the time. The official cause of death was heart failure. Her body had been through too much. The years of extreme dieting, constant pressure, and emotional weight had taken their toll. She didn't leave behind chaos or destruction. She left behind silence. But the silence didn't last. Hours after the news broke, the rumors started. Someone leaked a detail about a half-eaten ham sandwich found next to her bed. That one detail spread like wildfire. Reporters printed it without checking anything. The joke became the headline. Cass Elliot had choked to death on a ham sandwich. It was everywhere. That lie stuck harder than the truth. It was cheap, cruel, and easy to repeat. The woman whose voice carried an entire generation was suddenly reduced to a tabloid punchline. It gave people permission to mock her one last time. Late-night hosts made jokes. Writers slipped it into retrospectives. The real story of heart failure, of a body pushed too far, was buried under a smear. No one stopped to ask how painful that rumor must have been for her family, for her daughter, for the people who loved her. The truth sat in the coroner's report clear as day. No food in her windpipe, no sign of choking. But the lie had already gone too far to pull back. Years passed. The story stayed stuck to her name like gum under a shoe. People forgot how hard she had worked to stay strong in an industry that tried to crush her. They forgot how many times she'd been the one holding things together. The woman who sang "Dream a Little Dream of Me" with such warmth and soul was now the subject of a tasteless myth. And the apartment she died in? It got another story 4 years later. Keith Moon, drummer for The Who, died in the exact same bedroom, same address, same age, 32, different cause, different coverage. For Cass, the last chapter of her life became another thing the world misunderstood, but the truth was still there, waiting to be heard, waiting for someone to care enough to say it out loud, waiting for someone to finally set the record straight. A legacy reclaimed, a voice finally respected. On October 3, 2022, the sun lit up Hollywood Boulevard a little differently. The crowds weren't just tourists or industry insiders. They were people who came to finally honor someone the world had overlooked for far too long. Cass Elliot was being awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Nearly 50 years after her death, her name was getting the moment it always deserved. One not buried under rumors or backhanded praise, but carved in stone for what really mattered. Michelle Phillips stepped up to the microphone that day. The last surviving member of the Mamas and the Papas stood in front of a sea of cameras and gave the kind of tribute Cass never got when she was alive. She spoke about Cass not just as a friend or a bandmate, but as the reason their music worked at all. The glue, the soul, the voice that carried them further than any studio trick or producer ever could. For decades, the public had been fed a version of Cass Elliot that was incomplete. They saw the jokes, they heard the rumors, they remembered the tabloid headlines, but they forgot how her voice cut through the noise of the 1960s and 70s like a lighthouse. She didn't need auto-tune or fancy gimmicks. Cass could stop a room with one note. That's what people remembered during the ceremony. Artists, family, and longtime fans gathered to talk about her influence, how her vocal range opened doors for women in rock, how her stage presence made producers rethink what star power looked like, how younger musicians still cite her as a reason they picked up a microphone in the first place. The star wasn't just symbolic. It forced the industry to say her name with respect. It pushed back on the narrative that had followed her for too long. When people walked past that spot on Hollywood Boulevard, they weren't seeing a punchline. They were seeing a legend. That moment also gave the world something it needed: clarity. The ham sandwich story, the most ridiculous and offensive rumor tied to her name, was publicly addressed. Speakers at the ceremony called it what it was: a lie, a lazy, hurtful story that had no basis in fact. For the first time on a public stage, Cass's memory was defended by people who understood how much damage that rumor had done. They didn't sugarcoat it, they corrected it, loudly and clearly. Cass Elliot was no longer just Mama Cass. She was once again Cass Elliot, singer, performer, mother, and trailblazer. The voice that once filled every room now echoed through the streets of Hollywood with a little more peace attached to it. And as the crowd faded and the camera crews packed up, one thing was clear: the legacy that had been buried under jokes and lies was finally breathing again. The star on the sidewalk didn't erase the past. It made space for a new one. One she earned, one she built, one no one could take from her again. If Cass Elliot's story moved you, hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear what real strength sounds like. And if you believe legends deserve better than lies, make sure you're subscribed. We've got more stories like this coming. See you in the next one.